The role of a heavy weapons company is a simple one: to obliterate any enemies that cannot be overwhelmed with mass lasfire. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we'll be continuing in our look through the Imperial Guard Codex with a review of the Heavy Weapons Squad, one of the most iconic sources of heavy firepower the Guards can bring to bear. In this review we'll take a look at their datasheet, any obvious rules, buffs and synergies, and how I would field them on the tabletop at the moment. In the background, regiments with an affinity for heavy and complicated weapons will often maintain one or more heavy weapon companies to support their infantry formations with foot-based anti-tank fire to deal with threats that the rank and file just cannot stand against. It's rare for the entire company to be fielded together. They'll usually be sequestered amongst the various advancing infantry platoons, or dug in with good fields of fire to hold narrow choke points and provide excellent point defence for the amount of resources committed. So let's see how they perform on the battlefield. The Heavy Weapons Squad is of course a heavy support choice for Codex Astra Militarum, and at base will cost you 18 points, plus of course the cost of their heavy weapons. You get them in a squad of 3, each of them with a model base that represents 2 guardsmen fielding a heavy weapon, and besides their big gun they are equipped with a las gun and frag and crack grenades too. The heavy weapons have movement 6 inches, weapon skill and ballistic skill 4, strength and toughness 3, 2 wounds, 2 attacks, leadership 6 and a 5-up save. So very much guardsmen, just with 2 wounds and 2 attacks. Now heavy weapons teams are incredibly fragile to enemy firepower. At best they're as hard to take out as 2 guardsmen, which isn't exactly usually the hardest challenge, but they're even easier to take out because you can potentially just remove one entire base with an anti-tank shot, or even just a damage 2 weapon, such as an autocannon. They've pretty much always been glass hammers of the Imperial Guard, units that are usually pretty efficient in terms of damage output, but will die to a stiff breeze. You shouldn't forget that they have a las gun as well as their heavy weapon. You can absolutely fire both of them, and having a few extra random las shots at close range can really help out while your heavy weapon teams actually focus on eliminating a key threat on the other side of the battlefield. So each heavy weapon can choose one option from the heavy weapons list, and this list has seen some extensive points changes in chapter approved over the last few years. Starting with the cheapest, we have the Heavy Bolter, no longer the Mortar unfortunately. The Heavy Bolter will set you back 8 points, so a Heavy Bolter heavy weapons team will set you back 14 points, and an entire squad will be 42 points. Fairly uncomplicated, general all-round firepower. Heavy Bolters certainly aren't bad, and keeping the squad cheap is quite a nice bonus, just because when they die you won't be feeling their loss quite as much. The only downside with the Heavy Bolter is that it's a bit underwhelming in terms of damage output. It's good against most targets, but not great against really anything. In particular, Guard are usually fairly well covered for anti-infantry fire between the amount of las guns that we usually get, and we also get a fair number of heavy bolters mounted all over tanks, which are often just a more efficient place to take them as they won't die as quickly. In early 8th I think there was a bit more of a niche for these, but at the moment I'm afraid their damage output just isn't quite worth their points cost given how fragile they are. Next we have the Mortar, which for a long time was by far my favourite heavy weapons choice. I've got an absolute ton of these things, again back from early 8th edition before the rule of 3 came into effect, and you could have as many heavy weapon squads as you wanted. The Mortar used to be the cheapest heavy weapon variant at 5 points. It's now unfortunately taken a massive price hike to 9 points as per the latest chapter approved, meaning that a heavy weapons mortar squad will now be 15 points, or 45 points for the full 3 models. Now, Indirect Fire is a really good benefit for these heavy weapon teams, as it counters their major weakness that they're so easy to take out. You can park them out of line of sight, safe from any reprisals, and be fairly reassured they will get their damage output all game long. This is still the case, but now the points efficiency of the mortar fire is just so much worse than it was before. Mortar heavy weapon squads were absolutely the bee's knees at the start of 8th, but now their damage output just doesn't really keep up with some of the other options. Even before this big points hike, I certainly wasn't seeing every single guard commander include 3 mortar teams like they used to, being more tempted away by basilisks or wyverns or other options. Essentially you're paying 45 points for an average of 5 bolter hits on any unit within 48 inches. It is reliable damage output, and it will stack up over the course of the game, but they're now certainly more of an expensive luxury rather than a very cheap squad that you could be fairly sure would have a decent chance of getting its points cost back in terms of models slain. I'm afraid the recent points rise has kind of killed them for me, and I definitely will be looking at wyverns in their place as the main source of ignores line of sight anti-infantry firepower. Next we have a couple of 10-point options, the autocannon and the missile launcher. Both of these used to be massively more expensive to the guard. They've repeatedly come down in points cost over the years, and are now both fairly decent cheap buys. Naturally the autocannon will be better when taking out 2 wound lightly armoured infantry, or medium vehicles, particularly things that are toughness 5 or 6. The missile launcher is our tried and trusted solid all-round anti-tank option, able to be fairly efficient against toughness 7 vehicles, and having a good go at toughness 8 as well. Of course you do have the frag firing mode, which means that if you are having line of sight, then the missile launcher will also have pretty much the same damage output and points efficiency as the mortar as well. Though of course line of sight ignoring is a big deal. I actually think that at the moment probably my favourite loadout for the heavy weapons squad are missile launchers. A squad of 3 of them will cost you 48 points, so it's not breaking the bank. They can sit right at the very back of the board, with a decent long range to help protect them from the worst excesses of enemy firepower, and particularly if you get first turn, you can potentially be launching 9 cracked rockets into the enemy for less than 150 points. They're still fragile as hell of course, but I think their damage output is strong enough that in some matchups it's probably going to be worth the trade-off, particularly against armies that don't have that kind of range to strike you back. Finally we come to the premier tank busting option, the lascannon, which is basically a missile launcher but better, and it's also had a very nice points drop, going down to 15 points in chapter approved. This will mean that a full squad of lascannons will set you back 63 points now, so it is a fairly cheap way to get them onto the field, obviously at the expense of durability. For me, the lascannon heavy weapon teams are still just a bit too much of a liability to lose all the points before they've done any real damage, but again, if you do have first turn, or if you can set them up out of line of sight and have them move and shoot, you might be able to get a fair bit of decent anti-tank fire out of them before they go down. So overall, the heavy weapons squads have reasonably good damage output, but are incredibly easy to shoot down. They're going to be happiest sitting somewhere as far away as they can be while still being in effective range, ideally in cover, taking pot shots at the enemy. So let's look at a few ways that we can get more out of them on the table. Firstly, of course, we have Regiment Choice, and unsurprisingly the Cadians reign supreme here. Rerolling 1s when stationary is a great benefit for heavy weapons, because they're not generally going to be wanting to move if they can help it. Plus the Cadian take aim order will allow your heavy weapons to reroll all missed hits, which is actually a pretty efficient usage of it, being able to affect multiple big guns in one go. Overlapping fields is also a really strong benefit to getting the accuracy of your heavy weapons up by chipping a wound and then focusing the rest of your firepower, including the heavy weapons, on that one unit. You could have some very efficient damage output indeed. The Relic of Lost Cadia can also be helpful as well, giving them reroll 1s to wound for a turn, or reroll everything against chaos. There's not much not to like with Cadia. They're basically the regiment that's made for heavy weapons teams. In terms of the others, the leadership benefit from Katachan and Mordian can sometimes actually be helpful. They're only leadership 6, so getting +1 to that will mean that they'll almost never run away. Sometimes you can often lose the third heavy weapon team if you lose 2 of them in the squad and then the third goes to morale. Besides that, Vostrian can also help out somewhat. An extra 6-inch range never hurts. Obviously most of these have very long range already, but being able to set up even further back and still threaten enemy guns that fire 48 inches because your range is slightly longer is also a nice bonus when you can get it. In terms of character buffs, we've already mentioned that orders are pretty good. Take aim or bring it down for reroll 1s to hit and wound is going to be your staple, obviously particularly take aim if you're Cadian. First rank, second rank can also help out with those las guns if it's going to be more valuable to try and repel some enemy light infantry from your position. The rest are all a little bit more situational, as generally you're just going to want to buff their firepower each turn. Besides that, any characters that reroll 1s to hit, such as Yarrick or Harker, could be reasonable pickups, though heavy weapon squads, even in their most expensive format, won't be a large part of your army if you're using the rule of 3, so those buffs are only going to go so far if you're just buffing these guys. The guard psychics are great for defense purposes, but they're not as amazing on heavy weapons as you might hope, just because their unit size is so small, so even if you did put Night Shroud and Psychic Barrier on one unit, your opponents could happily just shoot the next unit. Finally, Commissars or Standards could help with morale for the unit if they happen to be around. In terms of stratagems, there aren't really going to be too many things that are efficient on heavy weapons squads, just because, as we said, even at their most expensive variant, there are only 63 points for one unit, so it's only going to be a small unit that's actually being benefited. That being said, Inspired Tactics could get you another order if you desperately needed one to get more damage output out of a squad. Take Cover could give them an extra pip of armor save, and as always, Vengeance for Cadia is a great shout when you're fighting Chaos. Finally, the Warlord Trade Old Grudges is another really solid way to get more out of your heavy weapon teams by giving you 4 rerolls to wound against the single target that you're most worried about. This could be combined quite well with a whole ton of missile launchers or las cannons turn 1 to hopefully nuke an enemy unit before next turn your heavy weapon squads are likely going to be shot down. So how would I run a heavy weapons team in a game of 40k at the moment? As I'd kind of already said, I think that Cadia is by far the strongest place to run them, both for their rerolls, Special Order, the Relic of Lost Cadia, and overlapping Fields of Fire. They all make the heavy weapons teams just that bit better. I already mentioned that my favourite is the missile launcher team at the moment, but even then they are going to be a glass hammer of a unit and one that you could very easily lose your investment without good return in certain matchups. I think that the deployment of the heavy weapon teams is going to be one of the things that you most need to think through carefully. They're going to take a big -1 to hit penalty if they move and shoot and lose any Cadian rerolls, but at the same time you want them to be safe from enemy fire where possible, while also having a reasonable line of sight to certain units themselves. Not a very easy combination to put all together. Ideally they should be lurking in cover somewhere towards the back of your lines, and I strongly think about deploying your Warlord with them, particularly if you're using a company commander with Grand Strategist, Kirov's Aquila, or Old Grudges for example. Both of those units want to be right at the back away from enemy advancing threats, so it's a good place where they can hang out together, and the Warlord can potentially order your heavy weapons to increase their fire output. If you're going first, I'd try and maximise the Alpha Strike and make sure they have good lines of sight and can hopefully deal a lot of damage turn 1. If you're going second, it really depends on what sort of enemy army you're facing. If it's one that does have long-range firepower that could reach out and touch the heavy weapons units, then it might well be worth just putting them out of line of sight so they can move forward and at least get off one volley before they go down on your turn 1. It's a bit painful sacrificing all of that firepower, but it might well be better than having them eliminated trivially for no recourse at all. If you're fighting a bit more of a melee-centric army, or you've got multiple heavy-hitting threats of your own that are going to be going forwards and drawing the enemy's fire, then it might well be that you're able to set them up out in the open and just blaze away all game long. This is probably the sort of game when the heavy weapons are going to have the most success point for point. After the first turn or two, any firepower that you get out of them is kind of a bonus, as you really can't be expecting them to live very long with the defensive profile that they have. I think unfortunately heavy weapon teams are struggling a bit at the moment, both due to the points increase of the Mortar, breaking the most efficient version of them, and also because of the proliferation of decent ignores line of sight weapons such as the Thunderfire cannons that the Space Marines have, meaning that there's really nowhere to hide from these guys, both in terms of range or out of line of sight. I think the rule of 3 also really didn't help heavy weapon teams. I know not everyone plays that, but I generally like to in my lists, as I like to play things that I could potentially run at tournaments if I wanted. And if you are using the rule of 3, then it's a bit unfortunate for heavy weapon teams, because they really are the sort of unit that you could absolutely spam loads if you wanted. If you could take absolutely tons of them, say 10-15 squads of missile launcher heavy weapons, they'd actually be a lot more of a legitimate threat, because they'd stretch your opponent's long-range anti-infantry firepower, and he wouldn't be able to eliminate all of them, therefore more would be able to strike back in the next few turns. Being only able to take 3 units just doesn't provide that sort of stress, likely meaning they could all be eliminated in one easy turn. In terms of competitors, the heavy weapon teams will be competing a bit against infantry squads with heavy weapon teams in them, and in general that's going to be a lot more of a reliable way for your heavy weapon to stay safe and firing all game long. I think that heavy weapons are perfectly viable to include in infantry squads, particularly if you've got a squad that's just babysitting a home objective. It can be a nice place to hide a las cannon and just have it plinking away all game long. At the moment, in terms of pure optimization, I think it is usually going to be best to mount your heavy weapons on tanks or artillery for the guard at the moment, at least to give the vast majority of your fire output. We've got some really efficient units like Tank Commanders and Lehman Russ Demolishers, which combine damage output pretty much as good as the heavy weapon teams, or even better in the Demolisher's case, provided you can get it in range, while also being really quite durable as well, so you kind of get the best of both worlds, and that's why I think that we see most people using their heavy weapons on tanks at the moment, rather than in teams of light, squishy infantry. I'd quite like to see some sort of buff to the defensive ability of the heavy weapons team, just to represent that they might be a little bit harder to take out literally than 2 guardsmen with all those sandbags and things. I think that'll really help them actually see a bit more play. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below, particularly if you've had any success running heavy weapons teams yourself. I'll look forward to reading any thoughts you have on the matter. We'll be continuing our Guard series over the next week. I'll be looking to look at the Carnodon new Forge World tank, and then maybe a bit of math hammer on the Lehman Russ turret options later on. So feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see that. I do have a Patreon page which helps support the channel. If you've been enjoying these videos, then feel free to sign up. I've recently added some benefits such as getting videos early, some prize draws, and ability to vote on upcoming videos for the channel. So head on over there if that'd interest you. The link is in the description below. Thanks again for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys in Guard videos next time.